For the record, my name is Jim Coles, and I'm the Director of Emergency Management and Fire Protection for Ontario Power Generation. The purpose of my presentation this morning is to provide you and the public with an overview of Exercise Unified Response and the lessons learned from this large-scale nuclear emergency exercise. I have with me today various members of participating off-site agencies, including on my left, Mr. Tom Contra, Deputy Chief for the Office of the Fire Marshal and Emergency Management, and on my right, Mr. Warren Leonard, Director for the Regional Municipality of Durham's Emergency Management Office. And as well, I also have representatives from Public Safety Canada and Health Canada. Following the disaster at Japan's Fukushima Daiichi Nuclear Generating Station, the CNSC issued its Fukushima Task Force report that recommended enhanced preparedness for severe accidents. Since that event, the nuclear industry and all levels of government have revised their nuclear emergency plans, procedures, and equipment. Large-scale emergency exercises offer a unique opportunity to validate emergency plans and their interoperability. After the Bruce Power Huron Challenge exercise in 2012, Ontario Power Generation took the next step and led the planning initiative to execute a full-scale nuclear emergency response exercise in 2014. Exercise Unified Response involved a full site blackout and a beyond design basis accident with off-site radiological consequences. This hypothetical scenario challenged every one of the participating organizations because it involved events that are rarely tested in such a large-scale integrated fashion. In particular, Exercise Unified Response allowed agencies to validate the interoperability of emergency plans from many jurisdictions at the same time and tested the ability of diverse organizations to work together to protect and inform the public. An effective coordinated response to any large-scale emergency involves a number of participants from many jurisdictions. And the best way to validate your emergency plans is to involve those organizations in the planning and execution of a large-scale exercise. And this is what Exercise Unified Response was all about. Besides OPG, other participants in the exercise included the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, Health Canada, Public Safety Canada, the Regional Municipality of Durham and their Emergency Management Office, and of course the Office of the Fire Marshal and Emergency Management within the Provincial Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services. A joint exercise planning team, which included the agencies I just mentioned, was established back in December of 2012 with the primary goal of planning the safe execution of a large-scale, multi-agency nuclear emergency exercise that would test the preparedness and integration of emergency response plans for OPG, provincial and federal governments, municipalities, and non-government agencies. As I mentioned earlier, planning for this exercise
Comme j'ai dit auparavant, la planification avait débuté à l'automne 2012.
$8.6 million to the project, and we began to solicit participation from various agencies. Mr. Chair, I believe your hard copies of the presentation have a typo at the bottom of the page. The correct project cost is $3.6 million. OPG also took steps at that time to secure International Safety Research Incorporated as a vendor to assist with the planning and execution of the exercise itself. OPG had already planned to execute a number of drills in 2013 with the intention of using these as opportunities to verify our own internal response capability to beyond design basis accidents. So the exercise that you see on this slide, the upper left, highlights one that we did in Darlington in August of 2013. At that time, we validated our procedures to deploy our brand new emergency mitigating equipment, or EME for short. In September of 2013, we invited all confirmed and potential exercise participants to our initial planning conference and workshop, which focused on defining the exercise objectives and verifying lines of communication between agencies. Health Canada had recently updated the Federal Nuclear Emergency Plan and planned a series of workshops and exercises to validate it, including Exercise Cool Breeze in October of 2013, and ultimately Exercise Unified Response. A mid-planning conference and workshop for Exercise Unified Response was then run in early December of 2013 to finalize scenario details, clarify expectations, and discuss exercise control processes. A workshop in February focused on finalizing the public information and media communications plan, and the final planning conference in April solidified the exercise logistics, objectives, and scope. And after all this, we still weren't done. We had to train all the controllers and evaluators in the 2 weeks leading up to the exercise. All of the major participating organizations I mentioned shared 3 common objectives, and these were first and foremost to demonstrate that the emergency response of the participating organizations can ensure the safety of the public and the environment. Secondly, to test the interoperability of the participating organizations and integration of emergency response plans. And thirdly, each organization would contribute to the preparation of a joint evaluation or after-action report to assess the interoperability and integration of responding organizations. This is what we refer to as the Tier 1 objectives of Exercise Unified Response. Each participating organization also identified its own set of Tier 2 and 3 objectives that were more focused on their internal response capabilities, and these were evaluated separately by each organization. The events that unfolded during the 3-day exercise were selected to test and verify all Tier 1, 2, and 3 objectives. With that brief overview of the exercise development and objectives, I'd like to run a short 12-minute video that will set the stage for more discussion.
Is Canada ready for a nuclear emergency? In order to answer this simple question, we need to understand what we mean by ready. Every year, there are natural events that endanger the safety of Canadians and require municipalities, provinces, and the federal government to prepare and take action when needed. Some of these events are actually seasonal. They are planned for, prepared for. And because we make plans, we can say that we achieved a degree of preparedness. We are prepared to prevent the forest fire from reaching the town, prepared to evacuate Canadians from threatened areas. These events happen on a regular basis. In fact, they may be happening right now, and Canadians expect their governments to be capable of protecting them from these events. So how do we prepare for less foreseeable events, like a nuclear emergency? Unlike a flood or forest fire, we don't believe that a nuclear emergency will ever happen in Canada. Yet, the consequences of this potential event are such that we must be ready for that possibility, no matter how remote. As an operator of nuclear power plants, Ontario Power Generation, or OPG, has safety action plans in place, multiple safety systems on their reactors, as well as emergency equipment to prevent a nuclear emergency from ever happening. In those provinces with nuclear power plants, local, regional, and municipal governments have developed detailed plans to protect their citizens. In addition, provincial ministries and federal departments also have detailed plans and capabilities to address their roles and responsibilities during a nuclear emergency. But creating plans is only one part of preparing for an event. Equally important is the regular testing of those plans, procedures, and capabilities. OPG also conducts drills off-site with the province and local municipalities.
Hi, how are you?
These drills include setting up and testing of reception centers for evacuees and emergency worker centers for the protection of personnel who may be required to conduct activities in responding to an event. To test Canada's capabilities, the development of a much larger exercise, one that included the response effort from the operator to all levels of government, was required. How did we test Canada's readiness for a nuclear emergency? Exercise Unified Response was an OPG-sponsored joint exercise involving all levels of government. The exercise simulated a nuclear emergency at the Darlington Nuclear Generating Station. Given that effective emergency response requires a team approach, Exercise Unified Response was specifically designed to provide a realistic simulation by actively engaging the participants, OPG, and all levels of government with a role in nuclear emergency response. An outside group was brought in to manage and coordinate the exercise, as well as set up a virtual site for much of the simulation.
All stations, this is lead controller, so hold off and inject 220 until we get notification from OPG that it's touched down.
In total, 54 organizations from local regions and municipalities, provincial ministries, and federal departments participated in the exercise. The goals of this exercise were to test and demonstrate the ability of all organizations to work effectively together in responding to a nuclear emergency in order to identify areas where they could be improved. Planning for Exercise Unified Response started 18 months in advance. A joint exercise planning team was established, which included representatives from all major participating organizations.
We're doing this to really impress upon you how diverse and how wide the scope of play in this exercise. It's unique.
In addition to these monthly meetings, planning conferences and workshops were conducted to engage the exercise participants and ensure a shared understanding of their scope of play and objectives for the exercise. One of the goals of the planning team was to create an exercise environment that simulated reality as closely as possible in order to engage the participants in the scenario being presented.
But the big worry right now is that conditions are right for a tornado.
By conducting the exercise over a 3-day period, it was possible for the participants to test many more elements of the response to an emergency.
The twister, as quickly as
It began with a situation at the plant that was complicated by a natural disaster. The situation worsened to the point where an eventual release of radioactive material to the environment occurred. Once the release ended, participants were faced with the challenge of working in a post-release environment.
56 beds and
At the beginning of the exercise, Ontario Power Generation tested their on-site response plans and the deployment and operation of their emergency mitigation equipment. As the exercise progressed and the situation at the plant got worse, the Provincial Emergency Operations Centre and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission were notified in accordance with established OPG procedures. Following their own plans, they notified the Regional Municipality of Durham's Emergency Operations Centre, the Government Operations Centre within Public Safety Canada, and Health Canada of the evolving situation.
PIOC, this is lead, Roger. Okay, so PIOC has announced over a conference call to all of the agencies that they've gone to general emergency. We're going to
After analyzing the simulated events and assessing the possible impact on the public, the Province of Ontario ordered an evacuation in the communities closest to the Darlington site. As a result, the Regional Municipality of Durham triggered the public alerting system, which tells local residents to seek more information through radio, TV, and social media. The Government of Ontario also identified the need to provide assistance to members of the public who could show up at the local hospital looking for answers regarding the impact of the emergency on their health. Actors were used to act as concerned members of the public and to engage the personnel at the hospital. Given the level of public concern simulated in this scenario, the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care deployed its emergency medical assistance team, which included a mobile field hospital, to assist the local healthcare facilities that received members of the public asking to be checked for contamination. As the exercise continued to unfold, Lakeridge Health Bowmanville tested the medical treatment of a contaminated casualty. This hospital has specialized facilities and medical experts that can provide life-saving and decontamination treatments. Exercise Unified Response also allowed the Regional Municipality of Durham to coordinate the arrangements for the Emergency Workers Center, the assembly point for emergency workers who must enter or return from the evacuated zones. During a nuclear emergency, Durham Regional Police Service would patrol neighborhoods being evacuated to ensure smooth traffic flow and public security. All vehicles entering the evacuation zones are logged, and personnel were issued radiation detectors. When the workers return from their patrols, they are checked for contamination and can be decontaminated. The Emergency Workers Center controls all of these operations and ensures the safety of emergency workers. The federal government was simultaneously enacting their response plans, and ensuring support to the province was coordinated and timely. International communication and coordination is primarily handled at the federal level, as the international community becomes aware of the situation, looks for information, and makes offers to assist in the response. In a true test of coordinated and integrated response, joint operations were conducted by field teams composed of provincial and federal responders. Each team member is a specialist with the training and equipment required to conduct radiological contamination surveys. For example, teams from Natural Resources Canada overflew the exercise area with radiation detectors capable of identifying sectors that would require further surveys. Survey information collected by the field teams was shared with the province to further guide their decisions. Exercise Unified Response also tested communications with the public. A simulated media website was used to provide news articles, radio news stories, and twice daily news video broadcasts about the event. This website made the exercise more real for the players involved by providing a news environment such as they would normally get information from. Since more Canadians look to social media as a source of credible information, sharing public messaging through simulated social media was also tested during the exercise. The exercise website also provided a secure area where press releases and emergency bulletins could be posted and shared with other organizations with a role in public messaging, allowing them an additional mechanism to ensure their public messages were coordinated. So, how do we know Canada is ready for this event? Exercise Unified Response created a unique situation that required the combined efforts of OPG, the region and municipalities, the province, and the federal government to overcome. Exercise challenges were met at each of the participating emergency operation centers and on the ground at Lakeridge Health, Bowmanville, the Emergency Workers Center, and by the joint field teams. Exercise Unified Response clearly demonstrated the ability of OPG and the various levels of government to coordinate their response to a nuclear emergency, but there were lessons learned from the exercise. The lessons learned will be used to enhance the current capability of every response organization and ensure the continued preparedness of Canada for this extremely unlikely event. We're ready. Now, what can you do? OPG, local city and regional governments, the province of Ontario, and the federal government go to great lengths to ensure they're prepared for this event. You can help improve your preparedness by staying informed. If you live near the Pickering or Darlington nuclear generating stations, read the information packages that are sent to your home, or visit these websites for more information.
As mentioned in the video, more than 2,000 participants from 54 agencies participated, including the many federal agencies listed here on this slide. The size and complexity of this exercise made it unique and unlike anything we've done in Canada since the Canatex 3 exercise in 1999, when we validated the new provincial nuclear emergency plan that had just been updated at that time. Provincial agencies listed here, including the Office of the Fire Marshal and Emergency Management, who have the jurisdiction and authority to direct the off-site response to any nuclear emergency in Ontario. Participating regional and municipal agencies and departments listed here include regional and local emergency services like the police and fire departments, as well as Public Works and Lakeridge Health Bowmanville Hospital. Non-government agencies like the Coathra, Pine Ridge, and Durham District School Boards also participated. We also included public participation in this exercise as representatives from the Pickering and Clarington Community Advisory Councils were invited to assess the effectiveness of public communications issued during the exercise. This level of engagement has never been done before and is a success in itself, as you'll hear later this morning from Mr. Brian Devitt of the Durham Nuclear Health Committee. There was also a significant amount of international participation during this exercise, including the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, or INPO for short. OPG emergency procedures and notification processes had recently been updated to integrate with the INPO Event Response Framework, which makes it easier and faster for OPG to access a vast amount of industry support during an emergency. Exercise Unified Response successfully tested this line of communication with INPO. Over the next few slides, I'll give you an overview of the exercise scenario in detail. In the morning of day one, the shift crew in the main control room responded to a large loss of coolant accident on reactor unit 4. The safety systems operated as per design to safely shut down the unit and successfully mitigated the accident. The shift manager declared an abnormal incident and notified the province, Regional Municipality of Durham, and CNSC in accordance with the Provincial Nuclear Emergency Response Plan. Soon thereafter, the Site Management Center was assembled and briefed. The shift manager later upgraded the accident category to an on-site emergency when he was notified of elevated radiation fields, indicating the possibility of failed fuel on Unit 4. A shutdown sequence was planned for the non-incident reactor Units 1, 2, and 3, starting at 1400 hours that afternoon. The picture on this slide gives you a sense of the size of the turbine hall. The nearest purple turbine assembly is for Unit 4, and way off in the distance, you can see Unit 1 in red behind the yellow Unit 2. Just when it looked like everything was under control, a tornado hit the Darlington site around noon, causing extensive damage and a station blackout. Operators dispatched to investigate why the standby generators had failed to start also reported that the cooling water intake structures for all 4 units were severely damaged. All 4 reactor units tripped, and emergency coolant injection water previously established on Unit 4 was lost with the loss of on-site power. At this point, Emergency Operations Center staff relocated to the common secondary control area so they could continue to monitor unit critical safety parameters on battery power. The emergency mitigation equipment, or EME, which consists of mobile diesel generators and diesel power pumps, was then deployed by the fire protection, emergency response team, and security staff to resupply the station with feed water and electricity to monitor critical safety parameters once battery power was depleted. As you saw in the video, the EME is stored in a light shelter on site but well away from the plant and is transported by trucks down to the forebay and the turbine building. The deployment of this EME allowed the boilers on Units 1, 2, and 3 to be resupplied with feed water, thereby averting a severe accident on those units. The emergency mitigating equipment stabilized reactor Units 1, 2, and 3. The boilers were available as the primary heat sink for the fuel on those units. However, the situation on Unit 4 continued to deteriorate overnight. The entry conditions for our severe accident management guidelines were met when the moderator had begun to boil off and our ability to cool the fuel was being lost. In accordance with our guidelines, a strategy to connect emergency mitigation equipment to the Unit 4 moderator system was developed and successfully implemented. This action restored the primary heat sink for the fuel and averted any further progression of this severe accident on Unit 4. During the night, a field operator discovered a problem with vacuum building airlock 1 door seals. They were leaking. Air ingress caused the pressure in the vacuum building to increase significantly, and containment pressure was expected to go positive at about 2100 hours the next day. In accordance with the Provincial Nuclear Emergency Response Plan, an accident which involves a radioactive release within 12 hours meets the criteria for a general emergency, which is the most serious of the 4 emergency categories. Upon notification of a general emergency, the Provincial Emergency Operations Center and Regional Emergency Operations Center go into full activation mode, and the evacuation of the 3-kilometer contiguous zone is ordered by the Chief as a default protective action. Further evacuation or sheltering in other sectors is implemented as required if the projected dose calculations exceed predetermined protective action levels, which act as minimum values for decision-making purposes. During day 2, the on-site response was focused on implementing our severe accident management guidelines. Throughout the day, the scientific section at the Provincial Emergency Operations Center was in direct contact with OPG, collecting plant status data on the state of the reactors and using that information to run dose projections in support of protective action decision-making. The Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care considered and ordered distribution of stable iodine, or KI pills, to the population. The Provincial Emergency Operations Center also collected information from the Canadian Meteorological Center and the Federal Technical Assessment Group and held discussions with the Regional Municipality of Durham regarding the implementation of evacuation orders for specific sectors. As anticipated earlier, pressure in the vacuum building went positive at 2100 hours on day 2, and containment started to leak out into the environment through the failed vacuum building airlock seals. The radiation fields at that time were too high for maintenance personnel to safely approach the area and initiate repairs. Shortly after midnight, maintenance crews reported that the emergency power generator number 2 was ready to return to service, and power was restored to the plant via the emergency power supply system. With station power now restored, Unit 4 vault air coolers were returned to service and were effective in reducing air pressure inside of containment. As containment systems came online, the vacuum building pressure was reduced and radiation levels at the vacuum building airlock were decreased, allowing maintenance personnel to safely complete the necessary repairs to airlock 1 seals. The containment system was now fully operational and no additional releases were anticipated for several days. During day 3 of the exercise, activities were focused on activation of the Orono Emergency Worker Center and other off-site actions to protect the public. After the release ended, police and emergency workers entered those sectors that were previously evacuated. Emergency workers who are required to enter those sectors first report to the Emergency Worker Center in Orono, where they were provided personal monitoring devices and received a pre-job briefing on the potential hazards. When their work was finished, the emergency workers returned to the Emergency Worker Center for contamination and dose control monitoring, which is a function effectively executed by OPG staff at that facility. There were a number of federal and provincial assets deployed on day 3 because of the release that occurred the previous evening. Ministries within the provincial and federal governments deployed various survey teams to conduct assurance monitoring. The Ontario Ministry of Labour and Health Canada both conducted ground surveys to establish safe areas where the Ministry of Environment and the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Food could take soil, food, and crop samples. Additionally, Natural Resources Canada conducted an aerial survey to assess the spread of contamination. Now that completes my overview of the highly complex hypothetical scenario, and I'd like to move on now to highlight the lessons learned from this unique exercise. As mentioned previously, one of the most important objectives of this exercise was to produce an interagency after-action report, and this report has been formally submitted to the CNSC. The report focuses on the integration of emergency plans and documents best practices, as well as key findings and areas for improvement. Best practices include receipt confirmation telephone calls made by sending organizations following the transmission of key information to ensure that the information was received. Command documents issued by the Provincial Emergency Operations Center were an effective method of communicating key decisions on protective actions and maintaining situational awareness across organizations. And the joint field operations executed by the Environmental Radiation and Insurance Monitoring Group successfully demonstrated the benefits of coordinated and unified operations between response organizations. The deployment of the Emergency Medical Assistance Team at Lake Ridge Bowmanville Hospital successfully demonstrated that a strategy to add capacity to a local hospital and reassure worried members of the public can be implemented effectively using special medical teams. The use of Health Canada's electronic mapping platform for sharing and displaying radiation survey information with the Provincial Emergency Operations Center demonstrated the usefulness of web-based geographic information systems for improving situational awareness and decision-making. Coordination calls between organizations engaged in public communication and the use of pre-scripted emergency bulletins are a best practice to be formalized by all organizations. Along with best practices,
En plus des pratiques exemplaires, le rapport sur l'interagence
the opportunities
identifie
for improvement. For example, existing protocols for notification between organizations are not
ne sont pas suffisamment
meet the needs of all responding organizations. For example, the regional municipality of Durham was expecting a written direction to issue potassium iodine pills. The province recommended the use of KI in their protective action direction, but Durham Region expects written direction from the Chief Medical Officer of Health in accordance with their regional nuclear emergency plan. The availability of trained and effective liaison officers in external emergency operations centers is essential to effective communication and coordinating activities. While some federal liaison officers were very effective in their role at the Provincial Emergency Operations Center, others were unfamiliar with the center's processes or may not have fully understood their role. Critical decision-making processes must be optimized between all response agencies to ensure effectiveness during an emergency response. In this case, the shift manager consultation with the province is expected and well documented for containment venting actions during design basis accidents. However, plans need further clarification on consultation requirements during beyond design basis accidents. Further guidance as it relates to severe accidents is required to clarify the roles of utility, municipal, provincial, and federal response organizations with shared responsibilities for protecting the public, the environment, and food and water. In this exercise, there was some confusion between the province and federal agencies as to who has the authority over the safety of impacted farmlands and the implementation of food and water restrictions. It was also identified that all organizations should review and update dose assessment and control procedures to clearly define roles and responsibilities for the management of dose assessment results. A supporting observation for this finding was that the CNSC injected an assessment that KI pills could be needed out to 50 kilometers. This severe accident assessment was delivered outside of normal procedures and created some confusion among the provincial scientific section and federal technical assessment group until it was successfully resolved via direct consultation between the agencies. Emergency plans would benefit from additional clarity and alignment on dose limits and responsibilities for the radiation protection of workers responding in a nuclear emergency. In this case, the Ministry of Labor emergency plans use different dose backout limits for their staff than those that are referenced in the Provincial Nuclear Emergency Response Plan. This led to some confusion at the Emergency Worker Center as responders had questions about how their exposures were being monitored and reported. There is a need for a clear process for providing timely information to the public, municipalities, and private agencies regarding their rights and claims to financial compensation for losses incurred during and after a nuclear emergency, such as relocation expenses, loss of business revenue, etc. Some stakeholders were not clear on the operator's role and responsibilities under the Nuclear Liability Act, and questions were raised as to whether the declaration of a provincial emergency would expedite the process of reimbursing displaced residents. The integration of emergency plans would benefit from improved alignment on the use of dose modeling tools and dose projection tools needed to assess severe or multi-unit severe accidents. Collectively, we need to better define the roles and responsibilities, survey and assessment strategies and capabilities, etc., for completing surveys during each phase of the emergency, such as before the release, while the release is ongoing, after the release, and during remediation. For example, the exercise highlighted the excellent capability of our federal assets to conduct field surveys, but there is very little documentation to support the integration of these assets into the Emergency Worker Center operations. Emergency plans could use additional clarity on the role of the nuclear power plant in public messaging issued by the province. In this exercise, OPG was not notified by the province prior to them issuing a public emergency bulletin about venting. This is currently not a requirement of the Provincial Nuclear Emergency Plan, but would improve a utility's situational awareness of off-site protective actions. Messaging to the public needs to be simplified and should not increase fear and anxiety. Some agency public communicators indicated that at times even they didn't understand some of the terminology within their own messages, and this could lead to confusion or misunderstanding among the public. Furthermore, media briefings delivered by OPG staff were considered at times to be too technical in nature and lacked sensitivity, which might have invoked an increase in public fear or anxiety. In conclusion, I'd like to highlight that Exercise Unified Response was a huge success and presented a unique opportunity that allowed emergency response organizations to validate the integration of plans at every level and test exercise objectives identified during the planning process. To do this, we had to use a hypothetical scenario that was more severe than anything we could imagine ever happening. This exercise required a significant investment by OPG and the other participants, but it was worth it. Although opportunities for improvement were identified, the exercise confirmed our plans are very well integrated and that these organizations can respond effectively to a severe accident in order to protect the public and the environment. Emergency response capabilities were assessed on many levels, and a number of reports and recommendations have been generated by the participating organizations, including the CNSC. OPG is committed to continuous improvement, so we will be actively reviewing the recommendations from all of these reports so that we can assess them for applicability and, where appropriate, incorporate their lessons learned into our own emergency plans. In fact, each of the participating organizations will continue to collaborate and incorporate lessons learned into their respective corrective action programs to further enhance their emergency plans, making them even better than they are today. That ends my presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you.